Hi, everybody. Welcome to Smart Sex, Smart Love. We're talking about sex goes beyond the taboo, and talking about love goes beyond the honeymoon. My guest today is Juliane Maxwald, a licensed psychoanalyst and ASECT certified sex therapist based in New York, specializing in sexuality, trauma, and relational dynamics. She has over 15 years of experience working with individuals and couples, and she teaches and supervises nationally across psychoanalytic and sex therapy settings. Juliane is also the author of Psychoanalytic Sex Therapy, Exploring the Unconscious Life of Sexuality, where she bridges depth, psychology, and modern sex therapy to help us understand the many of the struggles we experience around intimacy, desire, and relationships that are not just problems to fix, but expressions of deeper emotional patterns. Her work focuses on helping people understand what's happening beneath the surface, how sexuality, relationships, and emotional life are deeply connected, and how that understanding can lead to meaningful change. Today, we're going to be talking about relationships, desire, infidelity, and some of the deeper psychological dynamics that shape our intimate lives. And we may also explore the concept of outercourse, which is part of the work she and I have been developing together. Welcome, Juliane.
It's so nice to be here. Thanks, Joe.
Yes, and so I'm so glad to have you. Psychoanalytic theory is what I was originally trained in, which now we call psychodynamic a little bit more too. But maybe you could tell the audience what you mean when you say psychoanalysis with sex therapy.
Yes, absolutely. So, my training is primarily in psychoanalysis. That's kind of been my formal training. But along the way, I've done lots of other kinds of work, which is more behavioral, couples therapy training, and then most recently, sex therapy, trauma therapy training, and most recently, sex therapy training. And so this book is really my way of bringing those two worlds together and just talking about through cases all of the ways that our unconscious or the things that we might not really know about ourselves show up in sex and sexuality. Like I always like to say that there's so much more to the story than the behavior or the symptom that's showing up in sex. And I think of sex as the stage where all of our relational attachment issues surface, unresolved trauma surface, power dynamic surface. Like there's so much underneath the behavior and the symptom of sex. It's the stage. It's not the whole story.
That's so well said. What kind of pushback, if I could ask you, did you get from other psychoanalysts? And did you get any?
I did, and maybe not so much pushback, but misunderstanding, maybe a little bit of judgment. I mean, the psychoanalytic world is very thought based, and I love that about psychoanalysis. But it doesn't always focus so much on maybe like a practical application of of life or behavior, and certainly they tend to avoid sex and sexuality. And so when I was in my training, we talked about all the other emotions, about love, about aggression, about frustration, anxiety, for sure. But sex was always, I felt, left off of the table. And so I had a real interest in pursuing that independent of the training that I was getting there.
I think it's great. I'm glad you did that because I know psychoanalytic theory, I love it. It doesn't always it talks about sex and it can help people understand what sexual behaviors mean, but they don't talk about the practical steps of sex therapy, do they?
Right, that's right. And that's actually what I really love about sex therapy is that it dives into the nitty-gritty of sex. And there's a way that sex therapists can normalize sexual experience, are not intimidated to talk specifically directly about sexual acts, sexual, problems or issues. And I think that takes a real commitment to a kind of training where you normalize that and you feel comfortable talking about all of the many layers of sex.
Now, in your book, Psychoanalytic Sex Therapy, you talk about sexuality as a window into the unconscious. Can you tell us what that means?
Yes. So I think of the unconscious as a kind of language of the psyche. And that language gets expressed most easily through sex, or certainly shows up in sex, because sex is a place where um, where it's hard to fake in sex. Our desires sort of come to the surface in sex. Our insecurities show up in sex. We feel most exposed in many ways, most vulnerable when it comes to sex and our sex lives. And so to me, sex is a portal really into the unconscious. It's just a pipeline in the same way that dreams are. Sex is a way, if you're willing to explore it and get curious and interested in all of the ways that sex can be confusing, sex can be contradictory, sex can be overwhelming. There's a window into understanding yourself on a deeper level.
I love it because it's aligned so much with the way I think of. There's a non-sexual narrative that can help people understand themselves by taking the non-sexual narrative from what your turn-ons are. Is that what you mean?
Right. Yes, absolutely. Like if people really get curious about why is this fantasy turn me on, or why do I have shame around this particular thing that I'm interested in, or why do I shut down, in sex, or when certain sexual acts are being, are I'm being invited into. There's such a window into early relational patterns, power struggles, longings, insecurities, inhibitions. It's all there. And I think what your work really does, why I love your work so much, is you are not afraid to sort of turn the light on subjects that would otherwise make some people feel uncomfortable. And you ask us all, or not even ask us, but just show us the ways that sex does not fit into a neat box.
Yes, right. It does not. It's so nuanced. We both know this, right? And so confusing to people and so complex. And people want to make it like it's so simple, and it is not.
Right, right, absolutely.
What are some of the common stories that you see the psyche telling through someone's sexuality that you see in your office?
One thing that I see a lot is desire discrepancy, or the ways that one person might shut down sexually. And there's so many reasons for this, and I see it across the board with women and men, or gay or straight people. And there's usually a wider context for why. Like desire usually doesn't shut down for just a random reason. There's usually a bigger story around that. And that could be as simple as stress, in their lives, whether that's work or family or illness, health related concerns. Or it could be something a little more complicated in that you don't feel seen in your relationship, or you're holding on to resentments from a long time ago, or you have unresolved issues from your childhood around pleasure, or around slowing down, or around connecting to your body, or around desire. And so that's one of the very, very common issues that I see show up. And what I find is that most of the time, couples and or individuals were just never really given the language to talk accurately about sex. They weren't really given the opportunity to understand that sex is so much more than just what we do with our bodies. It really taps into some of our deepest longings, our deepest fears, our deepest insecurities. And so much of that gets laid down in our early experiences at home, in our families, in our communities, religiously, politically, socially. Like sex is a very, very layered experience, and it all shows up.
And this is a perfect time to ask you about to describe desire discrepancy, which, by the way, a lot of people don't know. Most couples have, where one has a higher desire and one has a lower desire. And you talk about it as a place where arousal and attachment collide. Can you explain?
Yes. Well, it's so to sort of jump off what you just described is desire discrepancy can mean a lot of different things. Desire and arousal show up differently for certain people. Some people might really, under a lot of stress, some people might turn towards sex or intimacy or arousal as a way of not necessarily coping, but as an expression of pleasure, as a way to to deal in, I guess, in a sense, with the stressful parts of life, where for some other people that might completely shut them down, where they might be somebody with more of a responsive desire, where the context of the sexual experience matters. And so there's all different kinds of discrepancies that show up. I mean, it could be where one person identifies more as kinky, whereas another person, doesn't feel comfortable exploring, more kinky or BDSM related activities. Or it could just be, somebody's arousal pattern is different. Like sex every couple weeks is enough. Whereas for some people, sex a couple times a week is more of what feels right for them.
And you also talk about how couples can move from frustration and pressure into curiosity and connection when talking about desire. Can you tell us how you do that as a therapist?
Right. Well, so that is really giving people the opportunity to see desire as something more than just frequency of sex, and to really help people kind of slow down a little bit and get reflective or get curious around, well, what does sex actually mean to you? Is it a way to connect to your partner in a loving, safe way? Is it a way to be rebellious and a little defiant? Is it a way to be playful and exploratory? Sex means so many different things to everybody, really. And so inviting couples to just slow down a little bit, talk about their relationship to sex, what it means for them, and how that gets negotiated between you and your partner. Like there's so many unspoken expectations around sex that just giving people the opportunity to talk about it in a thoughtful, reflective way with somebody who has a lot of experience working with couples, I find that in and of itself incredibly helpful. And from there, from there, you can open up lots of things. I mean, you can open up, resentments from previous behaviors that happened. You can open up longings for certain kinds of sexual experiences that maybe they're afraid to ask for, don't really know how to express. And so it's just, to me, desire discrepancy is the window into really discovering and uncovering what's going on between the couple or the partners, or what's going on between somebody and their own relationship to their self and their body and their history.
I love everything you just said because I think that also speaks to infidelity. And you talk about that in your book too. And before I ask you some questions about that, you know, I've been doing a lot of online, social media content, whatever. And then, my clients that come in here and people are all over the map about what they think infidelity is and what one partner thinks it is, another partner doesn't think it is. And I think about the quote in the field that couples fight over contracts they've never made. Do you see that in your office where they're fighting over an infidelity, but one didn't even see it as one and one did?
Right, absolutely. And that, I think, ties into exactly what I was saying before about these unspoken expectations. And half of the time, we don't even realize that we have them. We just assume that our kind of psychological operating system is the same one that our partners are living under. And until you really start talking about it and understanding like what feels like a rejection, what feels like a boundary violation, you don't really know.
You really don't know. And so you talk about though the third person, that it's rarely about the third person that was involved in the infidelity, but it's about what's happening underneath. Can you unpack that?
Yes. I mean, typically when, this idea that if you're stepping outside of your relationship and you're involved with somebody else, it's not so much about that person, but it's about the experience or what that person is representing. And and then the bigger question might be, why can't you talk about that in your primary relationship, or what are you learning about yourself that maybe you didn't know? If there's a kind of compulsive quality to it, what are you kind of acting out, or what is it about this experience that that you're learning about yourself? Or what is it about what's happening in the relationship that this can't be kind of openly talked about?
A lot of people say you can't recover and come back from infidelity. What do you say?
I don't think that's true at all. I mean, I find that the majority of couples or people that come into my office are successful at recovering from infidelity, which is not to say that it isn't brutal, gnarly, painful, uncomfortable work, because it is. And there's a lot that oftentimes has to go into it. And so I'm very open and very upfront with people when I start working with them. But I also tell them, the countless of couples and individuals that I work with who very successfully move through an infidelity experience.
Do you have like one example that people listening might want to hear of how that happens, or just like in general, how do you get past it?
Well, again, it's focusing on the behavior in the beginning is important insofar as that the person who was betrayed in the relationship, there needs to be a repair that has to happen. I mean, there has to be an acknowledgement that how painful of an experience, how much of a betrayal this felt to the person, that it actually really was. And then after you move through that initial kind of crisis phase, and this is assuming that the person has ended the affair, ended the acting out behavior, and is committed, fully committed to repairing the relationship. And then the work really becomes around, okay, why did this happen? Why did it show up? Why is it showing up now in our relationship? And what can we learn about ourselves, each person involved, and or our relationship, and what needs to happen in order to grow, heal, move forward from. One thing that I see so often in my practice, and this always really surprises people, and it's incredibly hurtful, but oftentimes around a big life milestone, whether that's getting engaged, moving in with a partner, having a child, losing a parent, it's often at these big milestone moments where you'll see an infidelity happening, because it's almost like an existential crisis, so to speak. And so that can be incredibly painful because it feels like an even deeper cut in terms of the betrayal. But that's a really good example of how, if we go a little bit deeper after we do some of the healing, if we go a little bit deeper and we start to really think about or look at or question, okay, what was happening at this time? Why was this happening? How were you responding to this big life moment, this big identity transition, for example?
Mm-hmm. We know that a lot of people have shame, right? The LGBT community has shame because we were shamed as children, religious shame, cultural shame. You carry your parents' shame and their parents' shame. How do you help clients move from shame and avoidance toward understanding and openness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that shame really goes to the heart of so much of the work that we do as sex therapists. What's tricky about shame that I find is it takes a while. For some people, it takes a while to really understand how deep that shame runs. I think oftentimes, especially with acting out behavior or compulsive behavior, people might not even realize how deep the shame runs until they stop a certain behavior. Um, and shame can show up in so many ways, like, uh, again, in ways that we might not even be conscious of. It can show up in headaches, it can show up in other bodily symptoms. And so the first thing is really being able to identify where the shame is, and then really just unpacking it. Like, where did that shame come from? Where did you absorb it? Did you absorb it from your parents? What did you notice in their relationship dynamic? What did you learn about sex growing up? What didn't you learn about sex growing up? what maladaptive messages around masculinity or gender or femininity, were you exposed to, whether that was in your family, in your community, in your religion. um, there's so many layers of shame. And so being able to just unpack that and identify it and recognize that so much of that um, has nothing to do with you, but everything to do with the negative maladaptive messages that you absorbed and are carrying with you.
And you also talk about ethical non-monogamy, which everybody online and everybody in general has so many different opinions about. And I always talk about how gay male relationships have been having open relationships, successful open relationships since the beginning of gay time, right? Like we've just always been able to do it. I'm not saying everybody does it successfully, but it's talked about and it's negotiated. How do you work with couples who are open or trying to become open?
Well, one thing I'll say to, especially to my heterosexual couples, is that heterosexual people can learn so much from gay sex because there is a openness, there's a frankness, there's a creativeness, there's a playfulness that can happen with, gay and lesbian people. There's a way that there's a uncoupling of sex and love, which is not to say it's a split because they can certainly be together, but you can yours your the way that you love somebody and the interests that you have in sex do not have to line up neatly, and that's okay. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's when we try to collapse them and we assume that there can't be any kind of discrepancy in there, or there can't be any kind of variety or uh, queerness, so to speak, in sex that I think straight people in particular get themselves into trouble.
I
Um,
agree.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, I forgot your original question.
Oh, no, that was it. It's helpful. And I think a lot of times people say, why are gay and lesbians so much better, or find it easier dealing with sexual shame or getting through, open relationships. And I say that it's because we've been forced to examine our own sexuality just to come out, and straight people don't necessarily have to do that.
Mhm. Right. Absolutely. I also think open relationships or non-monogamy and the ways that people are experimenting with them now are also forcing people to just communicate about sex in a way that they never had to, which
Mm.
I think is wonderful. That having a successful open relationship, again, depending on what your parameters are, typically requires a lot of communication and a lot of self-awareness and a commitment to be really honest about what might be coming up for you in terms of feelings and boundaries and fears and insecurities, and a willingness to really talk openly with your partner or partners about what's coming up.
I love every word you just said, and I always say this: monogamous couples need to do exactly the same thing, but they feel like they don't. I'll always ask my couples, have you negotiated your monogamy? If they tell me they're monogamous, they're like, what do you mean negotiate? Have they done each one of those things that you just said?
Right. And more often than not enough.
Oh, so let's talk about outer course, because you and I are working together and collaborate on this topic. We're going to try to write a book and get it published. And I started the conversation for gay men. I call it sides, where gay men don't top, which means they don't insert, they don't have intercourse by inserting, and they don't have intercourse by bottoming, by receiving. And we know that this isn't just gay men. There's people in the rest of the LGBT community, in straight people, in all people that don't want to have intercourse. And it's called, the clinical word is outer course. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that outer course touches on so many relevant topics in sex and sexuality today, from what you're describing in terms of sides, um, but also in terms of permission to have sex in a way that feels good for you. You know, Plenty of women struggle with pain related to sex. Men, struggle with erectile predictability or unpredictability. There's so much focus on this prescribed way of having sex, that sex somehow means penetrative intercourse, regardless of if that's, anal or vaginal or oral even. And it, and that's such a narrow definition of what a sexual experience can be like. And so the idea of bringing Outercourse kind of center stage and talking about what about all of these different ways that people can engage in a sexual experience, whether that's through fantasy, whether that's through touch, whether that's through role playing. It just allows for so much creativity. And I think it gives people permission to really tap into and be honest about, and for many, many people, learn about what's possible in terms of their bodies, their minds, an erotic encounter with somebody. It just opens things up in a way that I think is so needed and so relevant right now.
I really think we're going to be a great team on this because I'm going to be able to speak to the LGBT community experience and the male experience, and you're going to be able to talk about the female straight perspective. Not that we don't have information about these things each other, but I think it'll be more compelling for people to hear us talk like this.
Right, exactly. I think that we both bring something unique, but very similar kind of to the table. And I'm sure you see this in your practice, and I see this all the time too. I find people are so hungry for permission to think about sex in a different way.
Yes.
There's so many ways that a narrow script around sex creates so much shame, so much humiliation, so much worthlessness, feeling like you're not getting it right, feeling the pressure to do sex in one particular way. I find this that people are just, really eager to hear more about Outercourse and are very open to learning about it, engaging it, understanding that intercourse is not the gold standard of sex.
Right. What are some key things you want people to take away from your book, from your work, and some final thoughts from you?
I would like people to mostly to take away from my work the idea that sex is a personal experience, that it's a creative experience, that it can be a very profound experience, but that it's an individual experience, and that and to give people permission or to provide examples of the many, many, many ways that people experience sex, and also the many ways that people experience problems related to their sexuality. And if you're willing to sort of look beneath the surface to really understand that there's so much healing, so much growth, so much transformation that can happen through sex and sexuality.
I love it. Where can people find you, Juliane?
I am online on Instagram at Juliane Maxwald, and my website is www.julianemaxwald.co. And I'm on LinkedIn, and those are the main ways.
All right. And they can pick up your book, Psychoanalytic Sex Therapy, Exploring the Unconscious Life of Sexuality. You must be so proud of that. And I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I've scanned through it, and I it just resonates so much for me.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was a really pleasure having you on the show. And for those of you that would like to hear more about my work and the things I do, you can find me on smartlove.com. That's where the podcast lives, as well as Apple, Spotify, and all the other places you can find podcasts. But you can also find me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all at Dr. Joe Kort, DrJoeKort. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope you'll come back next time, and stay healthy and stay happy.